After a week of dire news, a glimmer of hope.
Things can be very volatile and can move very quickly, but pleasingly overnight we did see a reduction in the previous day's numbers.
New South Wales smashed daily testing records with more than 38,000 conducted yesterday alone. Of that number, only 15 new cases were discovered, all of those linked to the Northern Beaches cluster.
And hence that's why it is critical that we ask everyone to adhere to the directions that the Minister has put in place.
That advice underscored by the $1,000 fines issued to two people who entered Manly yesterday without exemptions, as Sydney-siders were reminded just how critical contact tracing is in hospitality venues.
Some of the visitors still think that it's funny to be putting in there that you're Donald Duck or Mickey Mouse or a false phone number. That must stop.
And travel restrictions are back in place, with each state and territory taking a different approach to people travelling from New South Wales and Sydney. If all that looks confusing, you're not alone. South Australia is struggling with its own policy, wrongly turning 100 travellers away at the border and placing around 550 into mandatory quarantine hours before those restrictions went into effect.
We apologise for that inconvenience, but we would ask that people appreciate that this is exceptionally difficult work.
And today, Queensland began reinstalling checkpoints.
So there will be a hard border closure that will be going in place. People will start to see barricades going up again this afternoon.
Meanwhile, the Defence Force has turned down Victoria's request for additional border support, a blow to Dan Andrews on the same day the final report into hotel quarantine revealed it could not identify who in the Victorian government was ultimately responsible for the use of private security.
I want to apologise to the Victorian community for the very clear errors that were made in this program. There will be people missing from the Christmas dinner table on Friday, and I am deeply sorry and saddened by that.
Those errors will be front of Gladys Berejiklian's mind as she weighs whether or not to lift restrictions in time for Christmas.
We really need to monitor hour by hour what's happening. We need to monitor and make a final call on Wednesday as to what Christmas and the next few days will look like.
2020 is not done with us yet, that's very clear.
Well, infectious diseases expert Dr Peter Collignon joins us now. Peter, there's 83 cases associated with this cluster. Just 4 days until Christmas and then New Year's Eve. That's two super spreader events. Is it too soon to be potentially lifting lockdown on Wednesday?
Well, I think it'll be very dependent what happens over the next few days. So far, the news looks relatively good. This appears to be a cluster. In other words, all the people are related. They've got it to others, and the contact tracers and the testing has found those. So hopefully that will continue, but the trouble is there'll be a risk for a period of time to come that'll go over the Christmas period. What will be really telling if we develop any mystery cases, particularly if they're not in the Northern Beaches area, because that would imply that it is in the community and circulating. But so far, there's no evidence of that, and given it's summer, hopefully that won't occur.
So there's questions around lockdown, but the more simple question is perhaps around masks. Do you think that the New South Wales government should be making them mandatory?
Well, there's no doubt that masks are of benefit, particularly if there's a lot of community transmission. They probably decrease your risk of getting infection by about 20%. But if you've got a lot of community transmission, I think you also need eye protection because, face shields, etc., because your eyes are a way of getting this as well. I think what the New South Wales government, I understand, have done so far, they've said, look, if you're in an indoor area, public transport, supermarkets, etc., then wear a face mask because that decreases the risk by another factor. But the most important thing is not to associate with anybody who's got respiratory symptoms. For those people to be tested, keep your distance and keep your intermingling down to low levels. That's more effective than masks. The trouble with masks is people can sometimes get a false sense of security. So it's really important to realise it's just one element of a number of things you have to do, and it's more effective when you've got a reasonable amount of community transmission or an unknown amount, which is probably the case at the moment in the Northern Beaches.
Talking about false sense of security, Peter, I mean, New South Wales has done a pretty good job up to now getting on top of these clusters. You think Thai Rock and a couple of the others. Do you think complacency set in New South Wales and that's why they find themselves where they are right now?
Well, I think complacency has set in. I mean, I can think of my own personal behaviour. I'm less, I meet more people now than I did 6 months ago. But I think this is an Australia-wide phenomena. To some degree, New South Wales has probably copped this problem because they just take the vast majority of overseas visitors or residents coming back. So this is a risk everywhere. I mean, New Zealand has had leakage out of quarantine. So has South Australia. So has Western Australia. So we need to keep on guard. And if we actually think we've eliminated, we don't have a problem, we can go back to 2019 behaviour, that's when we'll get a problem, and particularly worry about next winter when the risk will be much higher that these respiratory viruses might transmit.
So Peter, if there are lockdown restrictions over Christmas and New Year, how confident would you be that people will comply?
Well, I think at the moment we can be reasonably confident. As far as I can see in the northern beaches, which is really the hot zone, people have complied. They're not moving around, the businesses are closed, people are going into the area that shouldn't are fined. So I think we've had reasonable compliance. And I think that's very important because if this just stays as a cluster and particularly doesn't go to the rest of Sydney, it does imply that that works. And therefore other restrictions, particularly border restrictions, are probably an overkill because if you think of South Australia where it happened, a month or two ago, there were no cases other than those identified as close contacts by the contact tracers. That may well be the same in Sydney. So we've got this problem for a while to come, and at least another year, probably longer. We will get this happening, I think, on other occasions. We need to get on top of it, do it quickly, but be temperate with how far we go with the restrictions, particularly border closures and lockdowns, to make sure that that really does give us an extra benefit rather than being able to do as it's being handled at the moment, apparently successful, although we'll have to wait for the next couple of days to see really where that goes.
Peter, thank you very much for your expertise.
Thank you.
It's really interesting, Steve, isn't it? Because we don't know if we're overreacting, and we can't know until it's too late. So you kind of got to have the reaction before you know whether it's
Victorians went through the toughest lockdown, as we know, but we weren't in the middle of a period where you've got to lead up to Christmas and New Year's Eve. I think the trigger points are going to be really interesting. The next couple of days, if this does, I hope it doesn't happen, break out again, I'm not sure how you can tell Sydney-siders not to celebrate Christmas. It's going to be very difficult task for the New South Wales government to do.
And 138,000 Sydney-siders who got tested, that's a stunning reaction, isn't it? That should encourage everyone.
It shows that maybe they're not as complacent as we might assume.
Right.
Yeah. From expert opinions to in-depth analysis and reporting, the Project YouTube brings you the biggest stories from Australia and around the globe. Hit the subscribe button now for news delivered straight to your feed.